Peace and love, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrew Hewson. I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm here with my friend, Davidya Buckland. David is an author he's authored the book Our Natural Potential. I believe he has another book on the way. He also is the writer of a blog, Davidya.ca, where he explores enlightenment in the context of daily life and looks at how that relates to the fields of science and psychology. David and I have been having conversations for about a year, recording talks together. And this particular conversation is maybe it's the fourth, I believe, or the fifth of a mini series or a sub series of conversations that we're having on the stages of enlightenment, what I refer to as contextual modalities and what David refers to as stages of enlightenment. So David's model and my own are a little different. And as we come together and explore the nuanced descriptions, it paints more of a comprehensive picture. Here we're going to be speaking about the condition of pure divinity, or the reality of pure divinity. And I felt that it would be appropriate as we're moving into this, David, just to acknowledge the sacredness of such a conversation and really all the conversations that we've had, and to express to the viewers that what we're describing is not a measuring system. It's not a way to gauge any apparent progress for an individual. What we're describing are actual conditions of reality realized within itself. And they're so precious and sacred. To take them on as a concept and a way of comparing really is out of alignment with the truth of what is being expressed. So it's an honor and a privilege to be able to share on this subject. And I'm grateful that you're here with me, David.
Thank you, Andrew. You raise a very good point. In our last conversation on Brahman, we touched on the challenge of speaking about no thingness, the non-thingness of Brahman. And I mentioned there that Brahman is kind of like the afterglow of pure divinity, or ParaBrahman, as it's also known. And it's, yes, profoundly sacred. And you know, for myself too, it's something that's still unfolding. So there's not a complete picture. However, I was given some feedback, some understanding to see what the structure of it was, so that the unfolding would make more sense. We've talked in the earlier conversations about how there's these two processes, parallel processes, that support the unfolding, the stages in consciousness and the refinement and the awakening heart and the process of soma, those two kind of masculine and feminine sides of the process. Sometimes people will move through the process into Brahman without much refinement, enough to recognize what's unfolding, but not the deeper values of the feminine side. But when we get to this point, it's absolutely necessary for that refinement to have taken place. Pure divinity can't be known without that refinement process taking place. Sometimes I use the analogy of consciousness as a comparison. From our previous understanding, we understand that pure consciousness is the foundation of all form and experience. And in deep meditation and so forth, we come to recognize consciousness by itself, pure consciousness, prior to expression. and then we wake up to that as the self. With pure divinity, we're waking up to divinity without expression, divinity in its core nature, the source of the source, what Lauren Hoff describes as pure holiness, even in non-self nothingness. And we define that the qualities that we recognize within Brahman, those values that become consciousness, alertness, liveliness, intelligence, turn out to be qualities of divinity. They're kind of coming through Brahman and then expressing. Most people I know experience this pure divinity in a feminine kind of way, as a divine mother, as a profound feminine presence. I wouldn't say that's universal, but it's necessarily. But everybody I know so far has that they relate to it in that kind of way.
That's an interesting point that you make, David, and I have some observations about that that could potentially be relevant. Um, in this aspect of the unfoldment here, there came a certain point where that kind of that contextualization of it as either being masculine or feminine sort of came into the foreground, and there seemed to be um, what appeared at first to be sort of a stuckness in a paradox or something that was yet to be seen clearly. And because of it being pure divinity, it seemed that the possibility of it being an either or just wasn't there. But at the same time, there was, as you described, the prominence of this profound femininity, if you will, in an impersonal divine sense. And what sort of revealed itself was that this is the contextualization of pure divinity within its own realization, within its own mind, in this way, in this more feminine way, is actually what is most appropriate for our time. So, in the unfoldment of this planetary system and our current sort of collective status, um, this is the way that divinity seems to be relating to itself. So that's just my observation,
Yeah.
and it actually correlates with that which is most relevant for humanity. Yeah.
Yes. And there's a great deal in the old texts that talk about this in a similar way.
Mm.
Another important detail to understand about pure divinity is it's not known in the way that we normally know things, the way we know consciousness, the way we know a pen, you know, the home we live in, and so forth. This is all known by a knower as an aspect of consciousness.
Mm.
Whereas divinity is pure all-knowing,
Mhm.
and there is no person or value of a individuality that's used to know divinity. It's
Mm.
divinity itself that is knowing itself from
Yes.
a point.
Mm.
And it's interesting. It's sort of the same kind of dichotomy as in Brahman as well, because nothing is experienced as being created, and yet everything we experience is
Mm.
divinity in appearance. And that's kind of the whole thing about the world as illusion. Is it's not illusory. How to say this? It's illusory to think that the world itself is real in itself,
Mhm.
but in its deeper nature, that's the reality. There is a world, but it's the deeper nature expressing itself within itself.
Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful point. It's the difference between seeing only the appearance or seeing the essence of the appearance and seeing what it is that is appearing. And
Yeah.
that's where we discover the actuality of the reality of that which is seen to be the world. And it's really interesting that you brought up that point in reference to sort of the non-creation and the appearance. What I found is that in that stage or phase of nothingness, there was almost a clearing out that was taking place. And in the pure divinity shift, it sort of revealed that from a teleological viewpoint, the function of that clearing out was to make room for the divinization of all of the layers of creation that previously were being held from a different value. So in the stages before, it had to do with conscious awareness, realizing itself, recognizing its own intelligence, the way in which its own light is appearing in form, so on and so forth. And then in the nothingness stage, that again is recontextualized. So it's seen to be on the basis of thatness. And we are that qualityless no thingness, which then is although nothing is ever created, is appearing as all of creation. So in that, in the sort of recognition of the nothingness of creation, there is a sort of space or a room that's being created, you might say, which then I've found in the pure divinity shift, and at least in the initial stages of pure divinity, sort of fills up with the radiance of divinity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Here, there was kind of a process where it started off by filling from below,
Mm.
like filling with white light, not
Mhm.
a specific light, but just like liquid light
Mhm.
kind of flowing in. And it kind of came to a certain point, and there was still some shadow values, some unresolved uh, values in the physiology, but it's not the local physiology. I'll come back to that in a bit, but but it kind of reached a certain point, and then it kind of went around um, that shadow area, and that highlighted it. It sort of was unseen until that point, but it it highlighted it, and so it allowed me to go in and feel into it, and that process continues. That's one of the things I found is this process is far more exacting of the purification process. Anything um, that remains unresolved is being highlighted in various ways at various uh, in various aspects of the life to be seen and resolved, so that divinity can be lived. And so it kind of rose up to a certain point, and then it started descending in the same kind of way. And what I found fascinating to observe was that the physiology, in the more cosmic sense of it, is all driven by the Devata, the fine mechanics of creation, the laws of nature, um, the principles of functioning that create the expression, the doers.
Mm.
Um, and essentially, this process was immersing them in divinity,
Mm.
and that triggered some of them to have a spiritual awakening
Mm.
in through here, and that triggered a massive amount of purification. So basically, the there was this local awakening, so to speak, in a broader way, and then that awakening of the devas falling back into the collective, and that spreading out and triggering a massive amount of purification, which seems to be continuing to go on.
Mhm.
It really kicked up. up. Um, so yeah, so it's kind of there's kind of talk about physiology a little bit here too, for perspective. When I talk about physiology, I'm not just talking about the physical body, but there's those subtler bodies, our
Mhm.
emotional energy bodies, the mental body, the
Mm.
level of the intellect and intuition, the celestial or uh, a bliss body,
Mm.
and then the field of which is also the field of where our universe begins, and then beyond that, field of creation that contains that sort of the cosmic space of consciousness being aware of itself, and then consciousness itself. Now, within that field of creation, there is what I refer to as the Devata body. It's like a template, and the body is composed entirely of the Devata values. And
Mm.
because this is outside of manifest space out of time, um, they're essentially managing the expression of all beings in all time simultaneously. And then that is nested within the cosmic body, which is the body of all bodies, um, also known as Narayana, and various, firstborn kind of uh, concepts, like, ideas like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then that has a value of a divine body, a body just composed of that divinity. So we're talking about the divine flowing into the cosmic body, the Devata body, and then progressively into the subtler bodies. And I was shown that um, pure divinity, the ParaBrahman stage, unfolds within stages itself. There's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like a pattern. There's the um, cosmic consciousness, self-realization, God consciousness, and unity stages. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's the Brahman, refined Brahman, and ParaBrahman stages, and the pattern is somewhat similar in certain ways. Unity has stages, and in the same way, ParaBrahman has distinct stages, and they correspond to those layers of expression and to the structuring physiology, um, such as the chakras and the koshas and so on. So there's kind of correspondence between these substages and the layers of becoming, and the divinity moving in essentially into those layers. But there's a lot of purification to go on before that can be fully embodied. So this has been gradually unfolding here in progressive stages. It was interesting because I was finishing my first book, Our Natural Potential, talking about these 7 stages of enlightenment, and I don't I had almost nothing to say about um, pure divinity, ParaBrahman stage, um, because I didn't, I had just been tasting it, it hadn't unfolded yet, and it became clear that there were 7 stages, and I had to refine it slightly a little bit later. I made a small error in that, but it hasn't been unfolding corresponding to that, and essentially it also relates to 7 fundamental qualities of divinity, and how those are embodied by the chakras and by the koshas and by consciousness and so on. Um, so it's an interesting process to see, and of course there's going to be huge variation in how this unfolds in any given
Yeah.
physiology.
Yeah, that's a great point. The variation, I just for the viewers, it's important to recognize, degrees of refined perception and different variations of refined perception, which we've talked about in some of our previous talks. And it's even in a true pure divinity shift, it's not always going to be so. The processes that you're describing in reference to the physiology and the body are not always going to be so descriptively clear. So
Yes,
the same basic unfoldment is happening, but there may be more or less awareness of the details of that in the way that you're describing it, in reference to the movement from the divine body through the cosmic body and so on and so forth.
yeah,
So
that's very,
in
very true.
in reference also to the awakening laws of nature, I would say that there can be cases where laws of nature are awakening in the physiology, but perhaps in that case there isn't an awareness that is what is specifically going on. So
Yes, I have a very strong analytical aspect that goes into the detail.
oh,
And,
you and I both. Yeah, I
yeah,
appreciate that.
and
And
and also the refinement processes here has been going on since the 70s, basically. So
yeah.
been this progressive, and so the details have been unfolding. But it's one of those attention things.
Hmm.
It's unfolded where I've had the attention, where I've had the interest.
Yes.
Whereas,
Yeah.
our friend Dorothy Rowe, for example, has had her attention much more on healing
Yes.
and the more expressed koshas that support our body mind, and how she can help in those areas, whereas much less detail here in that sense.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful point, and it's kind of goes back to that point that you've made before about how each of us sort of has a specialty in a certain sense. So there's an expertise that tends to develop according to the flow of attention and what sort of what is revealed in the unfoldment through the appearance of a given physiology.
Yes.
One thing that I will just sort of look at here is a couple different ways that I've noticed that the pure divinity shift can unfold. One of them starts more on the manifest value, in the manifest value of conscious awareness, sort of coming back online from nothingness in almost in a thickening fullness. So in that no thingness, what begins to take place is there's this thick, full presence that begins to re-reveal itself, but it's in a new way. And this is actually the radiance or the light of pure divinity. And in that, the radiance has the possibility of then tracing itself back, or sort of, how would I say, milking itself down to the source value of its truth. And that's where that infinite supreme power is shining as that thick fullness. So
Beautiful.
that's one way, and that starts with the manifest going back to the unmanifest. The other way is starting with the manifest, sort of the sacredness and the holiness and the infinite love and grace starts to sort of shimmer forth out of the nothingness. And then it's filling up and then starts to sort of pour down as the re-revealing of the self as the radiance of divinity. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So those are just two possibilities there. And of course, I'm sure there's lots of variation in those. But there's also something that I call the field contrast, or the field point contrast. And I see the stages sort of having these contrast points arising, particularly in the freshness of a shift, where there's a new point of reference for our identity, for our reality, and what that new point of reference sort of has been revealed out of, or what we sort of have shifted out of into that. So there's this a sense of layering and a contrast in the layering. Now, this can be referential to field in the sense of manifest light and unmanifest source, but it can also be referential to field point, or it can be field point. Yeah, I know this may sound like, but it is true. So I'll try to understand it. Just, if you do, then you see it. And then what takes place as there is a unification and that purification begins to come online, David, that you were talking about, is that the contrast also begins to resolve. So there's less of a field contrast, less of a field point contrast. And a seamlessness begins to prevail in the condition. Yeah.
Yes. And some people actually can think that they're losing it a little bit,
Yeah.
because the contrast fades.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And I've actually found it's surprising how fast the
Mhm.
contrast goes away and it becomes
Yeah.
the new normal, especially
Mhm.
when after you've been through the unity process where there's a whole series of subshifts. You get used to your reality shifting on a
Yeah.
regular basis.
Yeah, that's a great point, because in early pure divinity, it's kind of like you can check in, to see if it's still there, you're still there. And at a certain point, that kind of dissipates. And because the contrast of checking in is not, it's always sort of it becomes more in the foreground. Yeah. So it kind of shifts from background to foreground, and even the whole background foreground seeming split, which it's not really a substantial split, but you know what I mean, also is resolved as that process of the deepening embodying of the physiology begins to unfold. So all of this directly relates to that deep purification that begins to shine forth with the radiance revealing itself to itself.
Yeah, it's not like the ultimate solvent. It dissolves
Yes.
everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's so amazing how we can feel pretty well resolved in nothingness, because just of the qualitative value of nothingness it's easier to feel much more resolved there. Because there's not really, there's nothing. So, and then in the pure divinity shift, we are sometimes in for a big surprise.
Yes.
The lights get really turned on, it's like, boing. Oh, there's a few little pieces here and there that I wasn't. Not only that, it also invites layers of collective material into its power, into its presence. Yeah, so we become sort of vehicles for levels of collective resolution
Very much.
that correlate with our own sort of individual experiences, if you will.
Yeah.
And
things we resonate with.
yes, exactly. Very, very, very true. Beautiful. Oh yeah, I was going to mention there's a concept I have of divine displacement, which I find to be useful. And that's as the radiance and the brilliance and the shimmering glimmeringness of divinity becomes more and more prominent and prevalent as a dimmer switch that doesn't stop. It's like a dimmer switch that keeps you can turn it around infinitely. Then there's a displacement of layers of unresolved residue and unresolved material. So it's actually like sticking your hand in a full glass of water, or even a glass of water that isn't full, whatever, that the light is displacing the remnants of that which is based in the illusion of darkness, the appearance of darkness.
Dissolution, yeah. Yeah, I think it's important here to mention too, because people naturally will compare it to their own experience.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about this whiteness of pure divinity moving into the physiology. We're not talking about energy. We're not talking about even, Shakti, although the higher values of the expressions of pure divinity could be described as Shakti with a capital S. But we're not talking about Kundalini or we're not talking about Soma. Soma has a white quality as well. It's an expression of divinity, so it has some features of that. But these are values of expression, and
Yeah, it's
certainly
not
some of those.
Not celestial either. It's not. We're
Yeah,
not talking about a celestial value. Yeah.
exactly. Celestial kind of has a golden thing.
Yeah.
It's it's transcendent to all of that, and even to say that it's white is kind of a little misleading. It just blurs out everything. It's so bright,
Yes. Yes.
and it's everything. So the quality of manifest light, it's white light is all light together, and it's kind of like that in a sense, but it's more than all that. And so we might compare it to that in a sense, and there's kind of the as above, so below. And so when you're describing pure divinity, it sounds a lot like some aspects of God consciousness, some aspects of divine unity in there. And that's the case, because there are those high qualities that are reflected as you go through, into more manifest levels of expression. But pure divinity is so much more, and you don't want to underestimate it.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the non-relative radiance of the one infinite reality. It becomes so obvious that it is the infinite reality.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably worth talking about God a little bit here, because um, there's kind of three primary ways, you could say, of knowing. Well, maybe four, I guess you could even say, of knowing laws of nature, primary qualities of divinity or laws of nature. One of them is just as a quality, simply as a value of being or love. But there's also the personal value where you experience a form value. So this is some, form like Krishna or Jesus or whatever you relate to, or laws of nature can express in a direct experienceable form. And there's kind of the Purusha value, or the Mahadeva, where it's a subtle form. They're embodied, but they don't have detail. It's kind of like an outline, but it's definitely a quality, and it has a form, some degree.
Mhm.
And then there is in its pure quality, pure principle,
Mm.
not as a law of nature, but just as a pure quality.
Mhm.
So, for example, Shiva embodies alertness, the observer aspect of consciousness. That quality of divinity can be experienced in a Mahadeva form
Mhm.
and can be experienced as a being,
Mm.
um, or just more impersonally as alertness.
Mhm.
And similarly, Krishna has the quality of love and sustaining, which relates to dharma, flow,
Mm.
kind of quality of divine discrimination.
Mm.
And, and anyways, yeah, it's interesting too. Krishna is an interesting one because Krishna means black.
It's dark, yeah.
Yeah, dark or black. Yeah, it's um, and when that value, the divine value of that started to unfold here, the the apparent unconscious background
Mhm.
of everything that had been experienced came alive.
Yeah.
I realized it embodied Krishna.
Yeah.
Emptiness became fullness. In that sense, even in the fullness, there was qualities of what wasn't conscious or it was empty. Um, those aspects were Krishna.
Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful point, and that's a sort of a recognizable stage in the pure divinity unfoldment, and because it sort of references the no thingness in a new way, um, to have an awareness of that, the possibility of that unfolding is helpful because it could seem like potentially at first that it's sort of a backtracking, but it isn't. It's just
Yes,
it's a re-revelation of what has already been tasted to some degree, but in a new context, in the context of pure divinity. And that, then that supreme dark Lord reveals you are that, on the level of the no thingness, but it's as you described, that the pure divinity of it, the aliveness of it, the all of those different qualities sort of come online and are revealed. Mm. And that's the what we could call the supreme masculine value from a certain perspective.
yes, exactly. There's
This
a
is oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and yet there's a saying that Shiva is dead without Shakti,
Hmm.
or inert, um, depending on how you want to translate that. Yeah, it's also interesting to reflect on the literature that's available in the traditional literature. A lot of the texts talk about self-realization and unity and the shift into Brahman. Not so much about Brahman itself. Again, it's how do you describe nothing. Um, but a lot of that stuff about higher stages tends to be quite dry. Like the
Hmm.
Brahma Sutra basically lists a series of intellectual recognitions or recognitions by the intellect. Oh yes, I am that also. I am that also, and
Mm.
kind of aggregate it describes coming together. And it's really very dry, and it's been confused often as a bunch of concepts, a list of concepts. Um, but pure divinity can't be described in that kind of way. It would be meaningless to. And so what you find is texts that are more devotional,
Hmm.
and essentially they're just long lists of qualities of divinity, or names of divinity that imply qualities, or
Hmm.
and they're in song. There's a famous sage, Shankara, who uh, is the founder of what we now refer to as non-duality. Um, and the early part of his teaching were quite dry, and he was famous for beating other spiritual leaders in debates because he had a very sharp intellect, even at a young age. He died at something like 33 years old or something. Um, but there's a later stage where he wrote devotional material that's not as recognized.
Mm.
And there's a story that he was walking along a river and his foot got stuck. He couldn't get his foot out. And he sees a washerwoman going over a nearby bridge and calls out to her for help. And she says to him something to the effect of, "Oh, it's all just illusion.
Mm.
It doesn't matter." That kind of thing. And he realizes that she's Divine Mother,
Yeah.
and then, and then writes this uh, beautiful poem,
Mm.
epic poem of describing her qualities. So that and there was a shift. So there's that shift into his later teaching. So the higher values, but that's that's largely been unrecognized in recent times. But
Yeah.
that'll come.
Yeah, it is. It is coming online now. It's really beautiful that you brought up devotion because it's been a very sort of intricate part of the unfoldment here from the beginning, and this directly relates to this sort of contextualization of pure divinity in the feminine value. Um, I described a different style of unfoldment that started with the refined value from your description throughout our talks, and the sort of fullness, the conscious presence, the vibrancy coming online first, and the field realizing itself through the sort of dynamic form value and the fullness value first, and then clicking in to the silent, changeless seeing value after. And that continuing to sort of have some dominance throughout the process. And I'm seeing that. I'm seeing that unfold and all around every week. That
That
sort of shows up in a new way.
that does speak to the development of collective consciousness. That
It
that's
does.
possible even
Yeah,
when the
it
world
does.
is all plugged up and sludgy. It's
Yeah.
not a way you're going to wake up basically. Whereas if that's softening um, and that becomes more of a vehicle. I mean, of course, there's always going to be interesting exceptions, but as a whole, on a more typical level, that's fascinating to see that.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's such a blessing to be able to observe it as well. Sort of how it starts to develop in its infancy, and then blossoms forth. And one of the sort of aspects of that is that sort of a resonance with a devotion, or sort of a natural flowering of devotion that directly relates to the radiance of pure divinity, because that feminine aspect that's recognized in the self actually is the enlivening intelligence, the enlivening power of pure divinity. Yeah. And it's not really it's not really clear until the pure divinity shift unfolds. But what does become very clear is that actually it has been the grace of divinity the whole way that
Yes,
has been guiding and unfolding the
yes.
process.
It's like here I was talking a lot about the mechanics of consciousness, and there was the observer and the observed in the process of experience,
Hmm.
and then becoming aware that consciousness itself had a source and arose from its qualities of um, alertness and liveliness blending together to create conscious awareness that then becomes self-aware and all this.
Hmm.
And only then did I become aware that there was this third quality of intelligence that was in there. Because that alertness or that liveliness didn't just agitate alertness; it actually stirred it awake, and it took a
Hmm.
direction. And there's this, and there's that, that Davidya value is the most subtle of the three uh, in consciousness, because that's where the intelligence expresses, and that's where the world comes out of. And it's that intelligence quality that's key to the whole thing. I mean,
Hmm.
without that, it's just you know noise, chaos,
Yes.
and that is the highest value in the sense of course, this is speaking from the intellect.
Sure, sure, we are. Yeah, but there's also something underlying the expression
Yeah,
intellectually.
yeah.
And
A pure devotion has been less of a process
hmm.
here, but there's been stages of that, like through
Yeah.
the God consciousness stage, with a heart opening. I had a very profound devotional period in there, and other points as well.
Yeah, it shows up differently for everyone. And I think the sort of point that I was coming to is that in the presence of pure divinity, uh, that sort of is inescapable. Some level of devotion, some level of just the sense of the majesty, the excellent, the majestic excellence and supremacy. Wow. Oh my
Yes.
gosh.
Yeah, sometimes
So,
people have these doubts about whether or not light will overcome, but it's just there's a I mean there's a need for darkness to
mm-hmm,
to hold form, to allow form to exist, to allow experiences to unfold,
mm-hmm.
to allow us to learn and bring out the detail of it. But we've been coming out of a darker age where we got a little lost in that.
Yes.
The light got a little bit low, and now we're bringing it back up again and restoring the balance. And what we're talking about now will become much more common.
Yes. Yes, it will, and it is. And that's also a great point in reference to the age. In coming out of the denser, darker age, there's a tendency to contextualize things in reference to the masculine. And so, even in conditions of pure divinity, oftentimes it can be sort of masculinely contextualized. Or that's the way that it is described or related to. Um, and as as the light becomes more prominent collectively, then there's an uncovering and a revealing of a different possibility. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about how this divinity holding itself in the feminine value is most supportive for our time and is most in alignment with where we are collectively. Yeah. Mm.
But it also points to the really major value of healing,
Mm. Wow.
because if that refinement and awakening heart isn't going to happen if we're well isn't going to happen unless we unload a good hunk of it anyways. we're
Yeah.
still we're still going to have some to work through, but if we're going to be invested in resisting and holding on to our past and what our regrets or whatever like that, um, that's just not doesn't create a space where those refined values can unfold because they're
Exactly. Or even running away and trying to escape. A lot of folks look at non-duality as an escape route. It's like, how do I get out of being accountable for things? Non-duality, right? That's the most popular.
let's avoid let's practice detachment from our karma and
Right. So,
our life and yeah get scared away a bit. Yeah.
and it's so, and whenever that does unfold, it's purely, I mean, it's intellectual. A lot of it's so intellectual and non-experiential. um
A friend
and
of
what we
mine calls
find is,
it,
go ahead.
just say the friend of mine calls it the non-duality landscape.
Yeah. Sure. That's an
All the
appropriate.
arguing concepts.
Right. Yeah. And what's really wild about it is that it's just blindness leading blindness and going deeper into blindness, oftentimes. But what we discover with maturity and through grace is that it's through facing and allowing and going into and holding and receiving all of those things that we've been pushing away and trying to get out of and escape, or say that we didn't have or didn't do, or whatever, all of those impressions. It's through just becoming the field of pure allowing, pure receiving, that just welcomes those into the possibility of resolution. And that definitely correlates with and is inseparable from the a pure divinity unfoldment or pure divinity shift, and the feminine aspect of our reality being clear and prominent. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So I thought it would be nice maybe if you and I, if we both kind of described the how this whole play of form is appearing from pure divinity. Just a
Appear,
quick
appearing to.
appearing to, right, and not, yeah. So maybe just like a quick sort of run through of the basic outline of that, maybe, and because we have different perspectives, and then as those come together, it's always nice.
Okay. Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah. So pure divinity is the only reality. All right. This pure divinity, in a whim, to know itself, in a whim, a musing to know itself, appears infinitely absent to itself. Now, this is like a withdrawal or a flash of supreme nothingness. And within this supreme nothingness is this potential that is based in structure, in the possibility of holding and providing the canvas. And in this infinite no-thingness, this infinite qualityless primary appearance is what I call it. The primary appearance is no-thingness. There's also awareness, but it's not awareness. It's inactive awareness. It's inert awareness. It's awareness that isn't self-aware. So then I'm describing it sequentially, but it's not. It's instantaneous, simultaneous, if you will. Pure divinity activates that infinite no-thingness and the inactively inert awareness that's present there. And that activation is what I refer to as the primary distinction. So it's almost like a drum. If you look at the structure of a drum, it's hollow. And then there's a skin stretched on top of it. Yeah. And in order for there to be sound, the skin is struck. So we can look at Brahman no-thingness almost as the structure of the drum, and there's an inert sort of awareness stretched over the top of it. Just bear with me.
Yeah.
And it's struck by pure divinity as a part of the musing. And this is the primary vibration, the primary distinction, the primary tension. It's also known as the pranava mantra. And this primary vibration reverberates and collapses into an infinite number of, it reaches an infinite number of threshold points, which are pranavic points, which basically collapse into replicas of this same primary process. So each point represents then a new pranavic reverberation. And in these points, what we then see is the primary sound begin to take on an infinite number of vibratory distinctions, which show up as multiverse structures. So an infinite number of multiverse structures arises simultaneously. And within each multiverse structure, there's a unique conglomeration or patterning of the sound in what we call the laws of nature, or that show up as the laws of nature for each structuring multiplicity. And in this multiverse structure, we see the emergence of this universe. In this universe, also that primary distinction, or that striking of the drum, that striking of the cymbal, and that primary vibration also shows up as a centralization principle known as egoity. So those points, those pranavic points, are guided by this centralization principle of egoity. And that centralization principle then translates into the structuring of the multiverse structure that arises within that unique vibratory patterning of the primary vibration. And so that centralization principle guides the expression of the universes, and then within the universes, galaxies, planetary systems. And then the centralization principle shows up on a given planetary system known as Earth as the guiding intelligence for the formation, the patterning of life. And there's a lot more to it. I'm skipping a lot of different things, which you, all right.
Necessarily.
So, and then that shows up as the appearance of two bodies speaking right now. So the primary distinction is also that intelligence of self-experiencing. So that is where awareness is self-aware, self-conscious. And that self-experiencing is what collapses into all of these infinite vibratory points of emergence, which then show up as multiverse structures and so on and so forth.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
It's interesting. I realize I don't think I've ever tried to say it all at once. I did a dissertation in the spring on this. That's what I'm working on for the second book, which I haven't actually been working on lately much. But
my disclaimer is a lot of details are left out.
Oh yeah, no, it's pretty hard to describe the whole thing. So yeah, I guess the perspective I have is that yeah, pure divinity is the source of the source, and essentially she has these primary qualities, and those qualities, well, interact is not quite the right word because it's not like something happens or whatever, but they're there. And so that quality of alertness, as I mentioned before, is stirred by the liveliness, becomes conscious. So the Brahman knows itself, it's alert to itself, but it's not consciousness. And then it takes another stage, more expressed, and consciousness becomes more expressed and becomes self-aware. You get this kind of subtle space of consciousness aware of itself. And then within that, it kind of like there's nested values. And so there's consciousness is aware of itself globally, and then at every point within itself. And those points express forward as what we call souls and beings who are then experiencers of this expression. And it also, and it's kind of like there's this kind of like divine mind. And as you mentioned, divinity has kind of like a thought, you might call it, even not as expressed as how we would experience a thought, but just like an idea, a meme, some idea, and it kind of creates this memory impression. Smriti, they call it in Sanskrit. And from the perspective here at the moment, that self-aware consciousness experiences that idea or whatever, and then tries to express it. Is trying to become that, and so it tries to mimic or imitate it, kind of thing. And so it creates this expression, which we experience as the appearance of the world, as an attempt to express divinity. And it's, the expression here, divinity is all knowing already, but consciousness is not. And so consciousness is working to know itself. It knows itself globally, but it doesn't know itself in all the details. And so it expresses those point values, and each of which has a different expression. And so each of us has a function in consciousness to know itself more fully and more, not imitate, but emulate divinity.
Yes.
To be higher and higher values of that. And then there's a progressive series of expressions of that where that space of consciousness, there's a nested value of that space within a space, where the space actually becomes what we would call manifest space, and the universe is expressed, and there's a kind of and there's the pranava as you describe, and there's this kind of there's the Devata values where they kind of it's like the vibrations are spoken,
Mm.
and they work in a group, um, and self interact and use the different sounds. Sanskrit's kind of the language that's closest, but the Devata use the sounds simultaneously,
Mm.
which we're not capable of doing. We have to express clearly, and so by simultaneously, and those interactions create a subtle geometry, subtle structure, and then the sounds modulate the field value that as it gets more expressed into um, air and so on, and that so that becomes the field of mind field, and then energy fields, and then physical form. And as it gets progressively more dense and solidified, and some things aren't expressed all the way. They're only celestial objects, or they're only mental objects like thoughts. Um, uh, and some things express all the way into physical form. And then there's a quality of what's known as dharma,
Mm.
that which sustains, that's required, because all this happens in a moment and in an instant. And so for it to be sustained over time and for experiences to unfold, there's this quality of sustaining that's required to keep it going, so we can um, have some stability in which to experience and learn and so on.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess that's kind of my nutshell version.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much for filling in the details. And yeah, that's beautiful. That's interesting. You mentioned Dharma. Dorothy Rowe and I just had recorded a talk not too long ago. It's not available yet, on Dharma, and I think we sort of explored how you know, Dharma reflects an alignment with divinity, to varying degrees. So the more aligned we are with the sort of ideal possibility within the unfoldment of that thought or that musing, then the more clearly our dharma is being expressed, or the dharma, sort of the universal dharma, if you will. We talked about
Yes.
all the different levels of dharma. There's a lot, but
Yeah.
and one, it kind of relates. Well, listening to your description, sort of brings to mind this reflection on the understanding of the sort of male, female, masculine, feminine um, presentation that's represented in this universe and in this planetary system. And it also is how divinity relates to itself according to a given context or environment. So on this planetary system, there's a distinct representation of the male and female values, and these are seen to sort of represent certain qualitative presentations. Yeah. And so, as you described, it's all instantaneous, simultaneous, already all there. At the same time, it's never happened.
Yes.
But in that all already there, it's not that we're looking at something as starting here and then coming here. The way that we describe it, it sounds like that, because we start at this point and then we kind of describe it sequentially to what seems to be something that is, but it's not in time. And the end is at the beginning, and the beginning is non-different from the end. Yeah. Or whatever you want to call it. It's not really an end, but you understand what I'm saying. So this, when it comes to, like, supreme mother, supreme father, masculine, feminine, the different archetypal sort of personified values of divinity, which are recognizable in form, um, as an experiential reality, all of that relates to the blossoming of the flower of in the mind of God in this planetary system and in this universe. So divinity is able to look back on itself and to see itself from this particular um, viewpoint, which holds the masculine, feminine values. And so when we speak about the divine mother, or the divine father, or the divine daughter, the divine son, it's this beautiful opportunity that's really unique to a given planetary system. Not saying this is the only planetary system where that is present, but that our planetary system has this unique possibility for divinity to realize and reflect and hold itself in this way. So that, just for whatever it's worth.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to go into that.
Right.
My experiences of that, because that gets into a whole other bunch of exploring and explaining to put it in context. But yeah, it's fascinating that the variety and the extent of the possibilities and that are expressed in creation is just astonishing. And as you get, subtler and subtler, the variety is more and more expressed. I remember what comes to mind is the Bhagavad Gita, Song of God, chapter 11. Arjuna is asking Krishna to show him his true form, and Krishna is, oh, I don't know, this is a little bit much, and so finally he does, and Arjuna is completely overwhelmed because it's just vastness of, it's like everything all at once, and all forms, all beings, and oh yeah, it's incredible, and yet divinity is more than that too.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to relate to what we were talking about a few minutes ago is this quality of time. Because time isn't there at the beginning. It's just there's, like you said, we've been talking about it like it's a process where it's just instant. But there's this value of the process of experience where it's differentiating these different values, and so there's this experience of time, and our experience of time relates to our relationship with the process of experience.
Yes.
As we shift it, we experience time differently. We've all had, time seems to really drag, and then other times time seems to go flying by.
Yes.
And that's because our relationship has changed. And I think at some point I listed about 8 different ways we can experience time. It's like as past and the future, as an eternal now, as past and future in the present moment, as eternity, as no time, timelessness, whatever, and so forth. All in that relationship, and the reason why we experience the world the way we do, through this apparent step of experience, of kind of unfolding it all out, is so that we can go through this process of experience and bring out the details. Because otherwise, it all happens at once, and it's like the details are just kind of lost in that. It's sort of like sometimes people are kind of like, they're in a big rush that they've woken up and now they want to go to the next stage, and then they want right away. It's like a race, but it's not actually really what you want, because you want each stage to have time to unfold and integrate and mature, so that you can get the full value.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of also reveals that there's this idea of a finish line, perhaps somewhere sort of nestled in there. Like, yeah, I would then I'll be, whatever. But it's really not like that. And I think that one of the most revealing things about pure divinity is how much deeper there is to sort of just
That's
flow.
important. That's an important note. These stages of enlightenment are they're not a goal.
Yes.
They're how we live life. They're what we live life from. And it's kind of like being a teen or being an adult is not a life goal. It's the vehicle from which we live life. And so it's a better place to be living life from. So they're worthwhile to work on, to try and culture. But they're not a goal in of themselves.
Yes.
So what do you do with that?
Right. Sometimes it doesn't come in so handy, right? when some yeah, like hold on a sec, let me
Yeah.
where are we again? Right?
It's like if you actually start talking about your life in a sort of normal social context, people are kind of like, what? It's kind of dumb it down to be normal.
Yeah.
It's even sort of normal anyways.
Yeah, so true. And It's one of the ways I like to look at it is a qualitative distinction. It's a qualitative shift in the way that life is recognized. So it's not about quantity, because quantitatively it's infinite. Yeah, it's
Yes.
a qualitative differentiation comparatively, which may or may not be sort of prominently recognized. So
Yeah, and if you read some of the old texts, like the Yoga Sutra, for example, or whatever, in the third and fourth books there, that they list abilities and consequences, kind of some of these kinds of things, and it's very clear that I mean I don't know if there's anybody living that fully at this time, and so uh, the awakening process gives you a platform for that to unfold on, but there is so much more that's possible that humans are capable of, and that we can unfold into that. We're just beginning. I mean, I still feel like I'm in kindergarten again on a regular basis. It's like some new value unfolds, and it's like, oh, okay. And it puts everything in a new context, and it's like, okay, what's still true, um,
mhm.
and what is the time to throw off?
Yeah,
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, my perspective that I described of how things become, I'm sure that'll evolve again too. It's,
sure.
it's evolved over the years.
Yeah, same here. Totally open. And that's one of the, I mean, when we have that willingness to be made like a child over and over and over again. Yeah.
Yes.
There's no end to the possibilities of depth. And so
Beautiful.
it is beautiful. There's a certain prayer that came um, when a friend was in the transitioning from nothingness into pure divinity. And we were working closely together and just sort of supporting that. And I call it the Immeasurable Prayer. And it's not a common, not within the context of your common understanding of prayer, but I thought maybe I would say it. It's just a short little. Um,
Beautiful.
so it goes like this: I is the essence of the essence. I is the root of the root. Far from being something or nothing, I timelessly shines. I is immeasurable power. I is immeasurable love. Far from beginning or ending, I timelessly shines. I is all, and all is I. I is, and I am none other than pure divinity. I think I messed up in that, but you can find the written copy on the website, my website. So, but I just want to thank you, David, for the opportunity to go over these stages in detail, um, for the glory of divinity,
Yes.
and for the sake of truth, because that's what this is all about: is the glory of divinity. It's not about any particular so-called personality or anything like that. So, thank you so much, and for our viewers, I was thinking that maybe um, our next talk we could explore the healing process and the intelligence of allowing and how that kind of shows up throughout the stages. Does that sound good to you?
Yes, that sounds like a great idea.
All right, perfect. That'll give everyone something to look forward to. So thank you again, Tim.
Thank you.
All glory to pure divinity.
All glory.